Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, of course, I thought that I would talk about the fight that ended up happening this weekend. And of course, the fight that I'm talking about is the interesting matchup between that of Keith One Time Thurman and Mr. Mario Barrios. And of course, a lot of you may have not watched this fight. Maybe some of you did. But when it came down to it, a lot of people, of course, probably did not buy this fight on pay per view. I actually did end up getting it. I said that I wasn't going to get it once upon a time, but there just wasn't much on this weekend. And I said, hey, why not give this fight a watch and see what actually happens? When Mario Barrios actually was up on the scale compared to that of a Keith One Time Thurman, I actually was surprised at how decently big Mario Barrios looked. I believe that he actually was taller when it came down to it compared to that of a Keith One Time Thurman. And Mario Barrios, even though I've never really thought him to be an A class fighter, he is a person that maybe has a little bit of class towards him. I would say that he's probably a B minus fighter. He is a person that has a decent amount of power. And of course, the last time that we seen Keith Thurman in the ring with someone that he underestimated, and if you want to say that was Manny Pacquiao, you could, but someone that, was not on that level that he did underestimate, with the Josecito Lopez, he did put himself in quite a bit of trouble. Now, the big question is, of course, about Mr. Keith One Time Thurman. Is this the same Keith One Time Thurman that we've seen about 5 to 6 years ago that was beating people like a Sean Porter or a Danny Swift Garcia, or, pretty much knocking out certain people like a Luis Colazo or other people like that, yada, yada, yada? Well, what I'll say is this. I think that Keith Thurman, that he pretty much had a very, very good performance, maybe even a great performance if you want to say that. But in my opinion, if Keith Thurman was going to really have that great performance against Mario Barrios, I think that he did need to get the stoppage here. It did look like he was very close at times, but there was a couple of times as well where it did maybe look like Keith Thurman was a little bit bothered by maybe what Mario Barrios was throwing back at him at least some of the times. Now, don't get me wrong, I couldn't really find any specific round to really give to Mario Barrios here, but this fight pretty much went down just as I predicted. A certain amount of people, of course, especially some of the channels that I seen out there, they were trying to say that, oh, well, getting past Mario Barrios wasn't no guarantee. Well, no fight is a complete guarantee, but I think a big part of the reason, of course, why they were saying something like that is because Gervonta Tank Davis, of course, in his last fight, he fought Mario Barrios. And of course, Gervonta Tank Davis is a very big asset to a lot of those mainstream channels at the current moment in time. But the truth is that Mario Barrios, he's never really going to be someone that is going to win an official belt. In my opinion, he's not going to win an official belt ever in his career when it comes down to it. And a certain amount of people, they may disagree with me. And some people may say, oh, well, he was the, regular champion, overall at the 140-pound division. I don't really count that as a legitimate champion. It just is what it is. Mario Barrios, if you put him in there in the ring with people, in my opinion, that can really box, I don't think that he's going to beat any of those guys. I think that if you, even if you possibly would have put him in the ring with someone like a Jose Pedraza, I'm not even quite sure if he would have made it out of that fight. Now, it was somewhat impressive, at least at Mario Barrios, that he was able to somewhat make it out of this fight, basically without getting knocked down, and also was able to survive in the first place. Keith Thurman still does seem to be a very decent athlete. But of course, if you were going to ask me when it comes down to it, after this performance, do I think that Keith Thurman has any chance to defeat, maybe when it comes down to it, maybe that of a Terrence Bud Crawford or an Errol Spence Jr., or maybe even that of a Yordenis Ugas? I would have to see him in bigger fights. We'll see what happens. But in my opinion, just taking a look at Keith Thurman for this, especially because Keith Thurman said that he wanted that Terrence Bud Crawford fight after this fight, do I truly believe that after this performance, that he has a great chance over Terrence Bud Crawford? No, personally, I do not. And I know a certain amount of people, they may disagree with me. Some of you may agree with me. But when I take a look at Terrence Bud Crawford, I think that he beat Sean Porter at a very decent point in his career. And the fact that he was able to stop him and the way that he was able to, in my opinion, at least in certain areas, look more dominant against Sean Porter than any other fighter that I've personally ever seen. I just think that Terrence Bud Crawford is a completely different animal now, pretty much compared to that of the welterweight division. And unfortunately, the welterweight division, and this is not me trying to strip away credit from Terrence Bud Crawford, but unfortunately, the welterweight division, even though it still is extremely talented, with some of the fighters that were very, very dominant there about, maybe even just 3 years ago, it doesn't necessarily seem to be quite as high in terms of his peak or potential as what it had used to be. Errol Spence Jr. is a fighter that I still think is a very great fight for anyone out there. but you do have to somewhat question his motivation. You do also have to somewhat question how healthy he is after a certain amount of injuries, and also, of course, the possible alcoholism that's going on behind the scenes. But let me not strip away any credit from Terrence Bud Crawford if he's able to win that fight, because Errol Spence Jr., he is a person all in all that is an extremely good boxer even to this day. There were certain people, that I've seen, certain channels that I hold in very high regard, where they stated that, they actually were not as overtly impressed with Errol Spence Jr.'s performance in the Danny Garcia fight, is what a lot of people said. I thought for a comeback fight, especially for a fight all in all, to where basically Danny Swift Garcia, he still was one of the top 5 dudes at the time, probably, and Errol Spence Jr. had not fought in a decently long time. I thought that he looked the best over Danny Garcia that I had ever seen anyone look, and that's kind of what I compared it to. I thought that he clearly won the fight 9 rounds to 3. So Errol Spence, more than likely, is still going to be a very dangerous fighter. But when I just take a look at Terrence Bud Crawford, I don't think that in terms of some of the ones that were dominant about 3 to 4 years ago, I don't think that any of those guys can really compete with him. Now, maybe some of you also believe that even at their best, Terrence Bud Crawford would pretty much whoop all of them. That's your view. What I'll say is this: I think that even had Keith Thurman been prime Keith Thurman in this fight, and maybe he was, maybe this is the best version of Keith Thurman that we've seen, in a while. Maybe that, this is Keith Thurman who's back, but I don't know if this Keith Thurman, in my opinion, will beat that of a Terrence Bud Crawford. I just don't see it happening. I give him maybe at most about a 30% chance. You can tell that he's still somewhat of a very intelligent boxer. I don't necessarily 100% like the way his feet move. Sometimes, in my opinion, he can be a little bit flat-footed or on the back of his heels, but it is what it is. He is a person that, in my opinion, can be hurt, especially to that of the body. He does swing also a little bit too wide, in my opinion, which would not work very well against Terrence Bud Crawford, because he's a very cool, calm, calculated fighter that can adapt to almost any type of style, and he probably has just as much power, if not at this point even more, than that of a Keith one-time Thurman. So, in my opinion, Keith Thurman, a big thing that would give him a great chance over Terrence Bud Crawford, in my opinion, would have been his prime athleticism and that one-shot knockout power. There was a reason why at one point in time Keith, one-time Thurman, quote-unquote, was called Keith one-time Thurman, because Keith one-time Thurman was looked at as a one-shot knockout blow artist, and I just don't know if I see the same thing there. I think that Keith Thurman still has decent power. I still see, a lot of the athleticism there, but in my opinion, if this would have been a fighter that, in my opinion, truly, truly had a great chance of really knocking out someone like a Terrence Crawford, or, really competing with Terrence Bud Crawford throughout the majority of the fight, tooth and nail, he probably would have stopped Mario Barrios. Now, some people may say, well, you didn't say the same thing about Manny Pacquiao, and he didn't necessarily look overtly impressive against Josesito Lopez. What do you got to say about that? Well, what I'll say is this: you certainly could bring up that point, but at least when Manny Pacquiao beat a Keith one-time Thurman, not only was he undefeated, but on top of that, Keith Thurman, you can tell, was somewhat competitive in that fight. I think that was a good, solid fight. I just think that Manny Pacquiao out-strategized that of a Keith one-time Thurman. I don't know if I even seen the Keith Thurman necessarily from that fight in this fight. It's not necessarily that he did not look good, but my big question all in all is, are you great? Are you at a great point in your career? We'll see what happens. We'll see. Some of the damage maybe has just gotten to him. I would like to maybe see him in a rematch against Danny Garcia, because Danny, even though he suffered a few losses, he doesn't really seem to be wore down at this point in time in his career. I would say a rematch with Sean Porter, but Sean Porter, of course, has retired. A match with Yordenis Ugas would be interesting, but, of course, Ugas, he's going to be facing Errol Spence Jr. next, so we'll see how that fight pans out. But when it comes down to it, man, anyways, I just think that it's going to be very, very interesting. Some people, of course, may disagree with some of the things that I say in this video. I thought that it was a decently good performance. Keith Thurman, I think he said that he gave himself a B-. I'd give him about a B+ to A- in my opinion. That's what I'd rate the performance, because he pretty much did what he was supposed to do. In my opinion, it would have been nice to see a knockout from Keith Thurman, in my opinion, because I don't think Mario Barrios is really A grade. But when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, Keith Thurman, he was able to do his business on Mario Barrios. He was able to be somewhat slick when it came down to it. He was able to move in and out. Didn't see him get hit with a whole lot of good flush shots in this fight. So, Keith Thurman, I think that he showed that he's at least in somewhat of a good point. I don't know if he's necessarily the same Keith Thurman that I've seen, beat Danny Garcia or beat Sean Porter, or even if it's the same Keith Thurman that was in the fight with Manny Pacquiao. But at the end of the day, this is a very good Keith Thurman. He, still is probably a top six welterweight, at most. When it comes down to it, at the least, excuse me. And some people, of course, would rank him even higher than what I just did. So we'll see what happens. It'll be very, very interesting. I wish the best for Keith one time Thurman, but if he actually is going to face out of an Errol Spence Jr. or Terrence Bud Crawford, I just personally believe that he's going to be barking up the wrong tree. But we'll see. All in all, what ends up happening with that. It'll be very, very interesting. Keith Thurman, in my opinion, he still is a very decent athlete. Maybe if he can catch Crawford early, maybe if he can make him uncomfortable, or even an Errol Spence Jr., excuse me, maybe if he can catch him on an off night, or maybe even if he just does what he does, he is still a decently intelligent boxer. I don't necessarily think that he has the same boxing IQ as an Errol Spence or a Terrence Bud Crawford, or even quite the skill set. But at the end of the day, he is a very decent athlete when it comes down to a decent punching power. It'll be interesting to see him against the Terrence Bud Crawford. It would be interesting, and I think that it would build up a lot of hype. We'll see what happens, but I don't know. We'll see. But anyways, that's pretty much all I got for today. Credit to Mario Barrios for pretty much overall taking an ass whooping like a man when it comes down to it. Can't really say much more than that. Not trying to be harsh, but it just is what it is. Mario Barrios did show a lot of heart in this fight, but he pretty much proved overall, he is what I thought he was. Which is that, he pretty much is a B minus to C plus fighter. It just is what it is. Mario Barrios is not a bad fighter. He's just not a great fighter. He's never going to be a person, in my opinion, that wins one of the official belts. He's never going to be a person, in my opinion, that is going to be a multiple weight division champion, unless all in all there's some sort of vulnerability, in my opinion. So it just is what it is. But at the end of the day, that's my opinion overall about Mr. Mario Barrios and Keith Thurman. We'll see what happens with both of these fighters. It should be very particularly interesting. And that's pretty much all I got for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.